Hello and welcome. My name is Bill Garrity. I'm the University Librarian and Vice Provost of Digital Scholarship. Welcome to this evening's Savor program, which the UC Davis Library is proud to co-sponsor with the Robert Mondavi Institute for Wine and Food Science. So the Savor lecture series aims to connect the public with UC Davis's groundbreaking research and discoveries in food and beverage. Tonight, we explore what a healthy food system looks like. We will shortly introduce you to three visionary chefs. They are leading profound changes in the food service industry by centering people, community health, and local food procurement in their work. But first, before we begin, we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we meet. For thousands of years, this land has been the ancestral home of the Putwin people. Today, there are three federally recognized Putwin tribes: the Cachaldehe Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, the Quetzaldehe Wintun Nation, and the Yokadehe Nation. The Putwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as the elders have instructed the young through the generations. We are honored and grateful to be here tonight on their ancestral lands. This evening's program is being live streamed and recorded, which explains all the hoopla, and we will have time for questions at the end. Our virtual audience can submit questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom. For our in-person audience, you all, please wait for us to get a microphone to you so the remote audience can also hear your question. Finally, before we dive in, I'm pleased to share that tonight's Savor program is also the companion event to the Thinking Food Colloquium, a scholarly exploration of the systematic roots of food inequity, which the UC Davis Library is also proud to sponsor as well. Now, and then I'll scoot off from the podium, I'd like to invite Daniela Gutierrez Flores, Assistant Professor of Spanish and Lead Principal Investigator for Thinking Food, to the podium to share a brief overview of what that initiative is about.
Thank you, Bill. Welcome, everybody, and to our audience joining us in Zoom lands. So Thinking Food at the Intersections is a year-long initiative that centers the humanities in unearthing the systemic roots of food inequity. In today's food-obsessed culture, we see a pressing need to question the discourses and practices that perpetuate injustice in the food, agricultural, and hospitality industries. Food is not just a product we consume or fuel that keeps us going. It is central to human culture and identity. It holds memory, fosters social connection, and reminds us in very material and embodied ways of our responsibilities to the environment and to one another. Thanks to a generous grant from the Mellon Foundation, we are thrilled to bring a series of conversations and cultural programs to our campus that explore these questions. From activists advocating for indigenous food rights, chefs reclaiming enslaved foodways, scholars reframing how we think of the history of food, and artists recovering forgotten food histories, these voices will show us how holistic, social justice-centered approach to food can be radically transformative. We couldn't be more pleased to have here with us chefs Norma Listman, Saqib Keval, and Santana Diaz, and to be able to bring you a taste of what's to come this weekend and this year through tonight's program. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Audrey Russek, curator for food and wine, who leads the UC Davis Library's strategic initiatives around distinctive collections in food, wine, and other beverages. She is currently working on a book project entitled Performing Culinary Citizenship, the Regulation of Restaurants in Modern America, and she serves on the editorial collective for the journal Global Food History. She is also a core member of the Thinking Food team, and I am thrilled to collaborate with her as one of my partners on our seminar series.
Thank you, Daniela and Bill, very much for the introduction. I'm very excited to be here tonight with our three esteemed panelists. And as Daniela and Bill mentioned, tonight's conversation is about healthy, nourishing food. That will absolutely be part of what we talk about. But we're also really going to delve deeper and talk about healthy food systems and food service, and thinking about that really in terms of holistic health of people as part of foodways, about labor and land and history, and also about community and cooperative leadership. So it is my great privilege to introduce our three panelists for tonight. Rather than sharing the long list of backgrounds and accomplishments, which would honestly take the entire time that we have here, I am just going to invite each of you to share a little bit more about yourselves as part of your responses to some of the questions. I do want to start though by welcoming each of you. Chef Norma Listman is a Mexico City-based artist, chef, and restaurateur, exploring the intersection of history, food, art, and politics in her culinary craft. Chef Saqib Keval is a food justice organizer, chef, public speaker, and restaurateur who comes from the cultural and ancestral lineage of the South Asian diaspora from Kenya and Ethiopia. And together, Norma and Saqib own and operate Masala y Maiz, a social justice-focused restaurant in Mexico City. Chef Santana Diaz is currently the Director of Culinary Operations and Innovation and Executive Chef for UC Davis Health. Prior to this role, my understanding is that you've served as the Executive Chef for the Golden One Center, Sports Arena in Sacramento, as well as the lead chef for Super Bowl 50. Saqib and Norma, I just want to say thank you so very much for traveling an incredibly long distance from Mexico City to be here for our conversation tonight and this weekend, these important conversations around food, sustainability, and social change. Santana, I just want to thank you for traveling almost as long across the causeway.
It was 13 miles.
Just about to be here tonight. So to start us off, would each of you begin by telling the audience a little bit about yourselves, but particularly how and also perhaps why did you learn to cook?
You got it.
Well, I mean, inherently, I think for chefs in general, myself not to be excluded, it's something that we learn from family. So I could say it's from my grandmother, and it's something as simple as tortillas, right? And growing up and making those things. But also asking questions, right? Where did the maize come from, or where is this flour, the harina coming from that we're using? And learning about family heritage and like what are, as a first generation born here in the United States, my family's from Mexico as well, so I'm from the state of Jalisco. So it's really about like, what did the family do there? How did they grow? How did they grow up? How did they eat? And learning about those things, and then now fast forward 4 decades, we'll leave it at that, 4 decades, and saying, how am I applying that towards supply chains in our food system, and how transparent are those supply chains, and applying that to health in a hospital environment, thinking about, okay, what did then my grandmother eat while she was in the hospital, and that food wasn't inherently the best. The stigma for hospital food that it's not that great is a stigma, although it may have all the dietary needs and nutrition that it says that you need to consume, but how did it look? Was it just a plate of beige, right? And so the computer systems that we use, don't necessarily tell you what the end product looks like. It just has all the nutrients that you need. So it just kind of was lacking that culinary, expertise, if you will, of knowledge of saying, oh, wait a minute. If we just tweak this a little bit more, it'll add this color a little bit. It'll taste this much better, this much acid, and maybe they'll actually consume it. And inherently get better, right? And so that's kind of the short story and the long right there of where I'm at now.
I don't have that romantic story of I learned how to cook from my grandmother, and I was in the kitchen with her cooking. I was in the kitchen with her eating. And I have to say that I have a grandmother that didn't like to cook. She had to learn, and she did it. She did it really well, but it was a means to sort of escape the family dynamic. And once she cooked, she served lunch, and then she was free, and she would be out going to the theater, to dinner, to restaurants. She loves restaurants to this date, and she taught me the love for food, but from traveling with her and from eating other people's food. I think a lot of my knowledge of Mexican cuisine and the different gastronomies come from traveling with her as a kid through all the states, and always, she's Catholic, so we'd always go to a church. And the main churches in Mexico, in the small pueblos, always have the markets attached to them. So I knew always that the church stuff meant really good food. Like I would have to put up with that visit so that we could get to the good stuff. So she instilled in me the love for Mexican food, but in a very different way. How I got to food, how I got to cooking, I really don't know. People ask me this question all the time. I've been cooking for a long time. I think I was really curious and really free to experiment. I've always liked to feed people. One of my first careers was in fashion and arts, and I was doing my last fashion project and my first food project when I decided to switch careers. I was working with a Chicano artist here in the Bay Area, exploring the last 8 hours when California was still Mexico. And through food, we recreated when the berry bolt comes to General Vallejo in Sonoma County. And we did a part fiction, part reality video installation that explored that moment. And we used original recipes and did a lot of research around the food that the Californians were eating at the time. And that project just completely blew my mind. And that day, that moment when we did that, I understood the power of storytelling and of telling history that recipes hold. And from that day on, I decided to go full on into cooking, switch careers, left the art world, and dove completely deep into restaurants. Fast forward to 8 years ago, I decided to go back to Mexico to be around the corn initiatives that were happening to recover and preserve land-raised corn. And we got the opportunity. Him and I had started dating. All of a sudden, I never wanted to open a restaurant because we know how terrible restaurants can be for labor rights. And I wanted to do something completely different. The opportunity comes to the table. First thing I do is say yes. Asked him, I was like, I'd love to do it with you. You have 2 weeks to decide. We're no longer going to be traveling and dreaming about Masala y Maiz, and you can tell that story. And here we are, 7 years later, after that night that we decided to open a restaurant. And Masala y Maiz is a project that focuses on labor rights, and it's a feminist restaurant. And I'm going to pass it on to you so you can tell a little bit of the story.
Thanks. I got into cooking because I like to eat. I guess that's the easy way of saying it. I have a big family, and I grew up cooking with a lot of this big family. Traditionally something in the community that's done by the women. My father and uncles all like to cook as well, but it's kind of very gendered, like what kind of work you do in the kitchen. Like when it comes to, butchering the animals or going hunting and stuff like that, that's very much like the men do. But then when it's making rotis in the kitchen and making the masalas, and it's all very much the women's work. And I found myself, I'd like to be in both of those places. One of the things that I appreciated was my family does large scale family functions every month. And there's, hundreds of us. So it's cooking for a lot of people, and it's cooking very large meals. And during that time, everyone cooks together. For me, it came about, food work was the first job I had, and it's always stayed as a job because we live in the US and you have to have like 4 or 5 jobs at any given moment to be able to pay fucking rent. So I was also a labor organizer for restaurant workers, a food justice organizer, a restaurant worker simultaneously, going to school, like all this kind of stuff. But through line was always food work. And like Norma said, I was very much against opening a restaurant because I'd opened restaurants for other people. I'd worked in restaurants. It's just a terrible, perhaps one of the worst choices you can make with your life. So we've opened 2 restaurants now. And like Norma was saying, Masala y Maiz is, the reason we did it was because we could do it as a labor-focused project, as a political project, and use the platform of the restaurant to push forward social change and not just better food system, but leverage the restaurant, right, as a tool to better a community in a very critical way. So we are very outspoken in our politics, but we work really hard to match that in how we operate and what our hospitality looks like and how we approach restaurant work.
And I want to, it sounds, all of you have, found your way into, cooking as a career, and you mentioned kind of change. I think it's important because what do you see from each of your vantage points now and the roles that you have as the most pressing area that needs to change in the food service industry?
For me as a woman, it's patriarchy.
Yeah, that. I mean, look at look at all the terrible things, right? They all come back to white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and how we refuse to acknowledge labor. But I don't think we can address any issue in the food system without first addressing patriarchy, because that is so closely tied to and intersects everything else that's so deeply fucked about how our food system operates.
I'd say education, right? So we don't know what we don't know, right? We do know that systems exist because it's cheaper and easy to provide something that's easy and maybe easy to mass produce and serve, but we're failing to understand first where that food is coming from, or where it's processed, how it's processed, and how good or not good or healthy it is for us, right? And it kind of ties into what you're talking about, right? But I think it's the education. If we don't know, how can you make the choice to make a better choice?
So, all 3 of you are here, right, because of the efforts that you are, doing from your roles in order to bring about some of this change. How do you approach building community or industry support in order to educate, or in order to, dismantle kind of the patriarchal system of restaurants and food service?
For us, it's personally is being super outspoken and direct and speaking without fear. We are based in Mexico City, and I don't know if everybody knows that it's one of the highest rates of gendered crime against women. 10 to 11 women die every day with no consequence. So when we started, we said we are going to be a feminist restaurant. I never considered myself a feminist when I lived in the US. I never could relate to specifically the white feminist movements of the global north. And it wasn't until I went to Mexico and I saw what was happening, and I saw the way that women and young women are organizing that really moved me. And then I also felt the responsibility as being a business owner to caretake my community. So how this looks like in practice is having a restaurant that only operates during the day. We are 12 to 6, and one of the reasons is so that people can have a life after the restaurant, but also that the time when people are returning home, it's a time where women can still be safe. If we ever do an event that goes to late hours, we organize transportation. We have we give micro loans to single mothers at the restaurant. We are really focus on pushing our leadership programs and having women be at the front of those programs. What else do we do?
It's a lot. So, I mean, I want to contextualize this, like Norma saying, right, in a city where so many women are murdered each day, that goes unaccounted for, to create a restaurant that is like intentionally feminist in operation, but also in politics, means working at it from the ground up. So, yes, there's the private transportation when we do late night events. Yes, it's only opening for lunch hours, but it's and the microloans, which means a lot for a majority woman run business, right? Where single mothers will purchase property, oftentimes in very predatory interest rates, as a way of having a safety net for their children. And they'll invest in property that might be in another town or the town they grew up in, wherever, and they just keep paying off these crazy interest rates. So we help them pay it off sooner so they have some financial stability. Comprehensive health insurance, profit sharing, we open cooperative businesses with our staff, we provide one-on-one coaching, there's a lot. But I mean, I think all that to say is the whole thing works because we put workers over profit. So any decision we make as a restaurant group first has to do right by the workers, and then it can do right by the business. And our staff have the agency and are tooled and skilled and trained to also challenge Norma and I in the decisions we make. Because sometimes we'll make a decision and they'll say, actually, we're not going to do that because that goes against our values as an organization. Even though you're the chefs, even though you're the chef owners and all that stuff, like, actually, no. And it's taken us years to get to that point. And I think that structurally challenging the way the hierarchy works and the patriarchy works in that way, in a systemic way, is what's slowly allowing us to see an impact in the way we work. But we're 7 years in, and this is just like, baby steps, baby steps.
The community impact of what we're talking about, can be seen in different ways, right? And so one of the things for the hospital, and what we're doing here with UC Davis's food program, so I myself started there in October of 2017, so I'm approaching that's the 7-year mark. We were at a local and sustainable food spend of 16.46%. 16.46% in 2017. We do 6,700 meals every day. Christmas Day, Thanksgiving, last Tuesday, tomorrow, every day. We never close, right? So the opportunity to have an impression and impact on our community is very huge. We have 6 counties, 7 if you count Sac County, right? And plenty of farmers and workers and communities. So, and then that's not even taking into consideration the sustainability and opportunity of reducing the carbon footprint of how far your food's traveling. But why weren't we doing that, right? And so, we talk about the transparency of this food system, and I mentioned earlier, it's a focus on what's cheapest and easiest, right? If every vegetable that I order from my broadliner comes in the same size box, it fits really nicely in my cooler, right? But that's not a priority, and is that really impacting our community? The answer is no. A true impact would be like what our program looks like now, as now UC Davis Health is the leader in sustainable food procurement in the entire UC system, right? So we're approaching right now, we're trending at 70% local and sustainable spend. It's unheard of, right? And it's a hospital right on top of that, right? And as we look to collaborate more with the UC Davis campus here, we can actually make an even bigger impact. But what does that impact look like? Yolo County. We're in Yolo County, right? Durst Organics, 800-acre organic farm, pays all their workers a livable wage, actually a great salary, and practices what, he came to UC Davis himself. He learns from the students here. And why wouldn't we support purchasing from an entity like that? Well, we do. Right? And so when we look at all those organic farms, whether it's Full Belly Farms here, River Dog Farms is here in Yolo County, you go to Placer County, you have Twin Peaks. We can provide great tasting food while supporting the greater community in a multi-layered fashion, right? And then understand where that money's really going versus an umbrella fake farm name that the broadliners are selling to the masses, right? So these impacts to our community through advocacy, whatever that advocacy looks like, ours is in purchasing locally and from the right farmers that we can and ranchers that we can, to supporting women and those rights and what they need to be able to, how they need to be supported in Mexico, right? It's just different on how, it's just food, right? But it's more than just food. It touches all of us in a different way.
And I think, as you say, the kind of the just food, or the more simple approaches, we sometimes think to what really is all of you are describing are really, really challenging structural changes that are happening on a very higher level. Because one of the things I was thinking about too is that how, as another term we often talk about, a way of individually making changes by eating local, right? I mean that's something that people I think are sort of more trained a little bit to do, is maybe look and see, look at the sign when they go into a grocery store, either go to a farmer's market or look at the sign at the grocery store and see where something's from. And that can also certainly mean one thing in California here than it does in Mexico City or it does somewhere else in the United States. And so I think that is something perhaps if you could talk a little bit more about, because I think all of you see this in your work, is what are some of the nuances to the idea of eating local or eating locally that emerge then in your kitchens or on your menus or with the contracts you have to work with, because it's not quite as simple as I think we sometimes imagine it might be.
You should start, because
Yeah,
your
The contracts, institutions have the power to truly pave a way for any other entity, like the restaurateurs, and so, because if we're not purchasing what's and supporting what grows organically in our regions, how is the local restaurant going to purchase from that farmer if they're not growing the item, right? And I always talk about asparagus, and so, but this can apply to anything else. We could talk about squash, we could talk about butternut squash right now, right? So we're purchasing, again, from Durst and River Dog, and we're in butternut squash season. If we're not purchasing that, who's to say, I mean, in your local grocery store, just turn it over. Look at where that's coming from. A lot of Mexican farmers are growing those squashes, right? And so if our local California farmers can't compete with that pricing market, why would they grow the same thing? That's the craziness thing, right? Like, oh, I'll just grow it better next year. It's not going to be cheaper next year, right? So then you're still going to be growing this product that you can't sell. And what happens? You can't pay your loans as a farmer. You can't pay off your bills, and so you are forced to change what you grow, right? Or try to figure out some other innovative way to sell your product. Pennies on the dollar, right? So you're losing either way. So unless you forward contract with an entity as large as us, as stable as us, that's the difference between a hospital and a football stadium. I don't know how many of you know, it's football season right now, how many home games are at your favorite team's stadium? I'll tell you, 10. Last time I checked, there's 365 days in a year, right? So it's a little bit short of being consistent, right? Basketball, how many games? 48, right? Baseball, 89, right? So it's like, okay, there's nothing is consistent as the hospital or institutions like a hospital that I can say next season it's going to be this amount. It's 9,500 pounds of asparagus every season in the spring. Oh, it's 12,000 pounds of butternut squash. So every year they can bank on that, right? And then the local restaurants can actually order from him as well, or her, whomever the farmer is, or rancher at the same time. That's community support. That's making an impact. At the same time, securing the bounty of this region. Because what is the end game? That's the interesting part. If we stop growing this stuff, and we start outsourcing it, I mean, it gets pretty complicated about what happens if, that food source gets cut off, right? So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that, we're in. Here I'm just trying to advocate for the local farmer and rancher of local food. But really what it comes down to is in the winter, whenever you have a grill out or a barbecue or, this winter, and you're going to do burgers, how many of you are going to actually buy tomatoes? Probably most of you, because you're conditioned to buy tomatoes, lettuce, and onions to serve with your burgers, along with your ketchup and mustard. Tomatoes aren't in season in the winter, by the way. We all know that, but we are just conditioned to do it. So we have to be thinking about what we're doing, which plays into menu engineering.
And if I may follow up on this too, like, I mean, another thing that at least here in California, we often put on our burgers is avocado. And I was, if you could even also address too, so what are some of the repercussions of, U.S. Food habits and kind of how people purchase food in Mexico?
Has anybody heard here about the avocado wars? Yeah. So, the next time you eat an avocado toast, think about that. The most consumptions of avocados from Mexico happens to this country. And what that means is that the agricultural landscape of the state of Michoacan has completely changed and has completely been dominated by narcos. So narcos have infiltrated not only in the drug and weapon trade, but now wherever they see that there's a profit to be made, they take that industry, and they have taken over avocados and limes. And this goes completely tied to what you were saying. If we don't eat in season, and if we don't eat locally, and start looking at another country, in this case Mexico, to supply that demand, there are very serious repercussions that most of the time we don't think about when we're here. And the same thing happens with tequila, with mezcal, with cacao. There are corn. There's all of our food choices, and everything that we eat and how we eat it and the amount and what we demand from the land has also a social and a cultural repercussions. And sometimes they're more serious than others. In this case, it's very serious. People are losing their lives because of avocados.
I want to talk about this in a little different way. But also, these points are really good. In the US, I feel like we consume in such a way that we don't have to deal with the consequences of our consumption, right? Drugs, name them, guns, of course. But our food choices, we follow whatever the latest food trend is. Avocado toast from the 2000s, like, of course, amaranth, quinoa, mezcal is becoming very popular, but like all this stuff, like Norma was saying, has this massive impact. But what we do in the US really well is shield ourselves or barricade ourselves from dealing with the impact of our choices, because they get outsourced to countries in the global south, right? Our chocolate comes from some darker nation that we don't have to deal with, oftentimes with child labor in the supply chain that just no chocolate company can get rid of. Avocado coming from Michoacan, and the quinoa, the craze ruining so many indigenous communities, right? Like all these food trends that for us seem like, oh, you go to the local cafe that's branded as the eating local spot with the local chef and all that, and you feel really good about your purchases because you're investing in your local economy and buying local and all that. But if you're not asking where the sourcing is coming from, where the ingredients are coming from, where what season you're eating it in, right? Like all those implications then kind of pile up, and the impacts of it increase as you move through the food system and down the food chain. I hate the discourse around eating local because I often find it to be really privileged and kind of whitewashed in this way to make us feel good about our choices without having to critically think about what it is that we're actually engaging in. Who has the privilege to eat local? That means you live in a community that has access to fresh and healthy food. That means you don't live in the hood that's been redlined through Reagan-era government policies that have forcibly separated you and your family and your community from healthy food, right? That means that you live in neighborhoods where there's a level of education that has prioritized health and nutrition in your school, and perhaps a school food program and all this stuff to build a healthy community, that is all assuming a level of privilege. When we look at the way our food system in the U.S. is built, we have so much hunger and starvation and so poor nutrition, and all of that is by design. No one just happens to be hungry. This is not something that someone just falls into, like, oh, I lost my job, or oh, I like magically woke up one day and don't have access to food. When you look at the amount of food waste and the amount of excess of food and the mismanagement of our food system and the way we're pushed away and conditioned, like Chef Santana is saying, to eat out of season and eat imported ingredients and to consume from the other and exploit darker nations, right? All of that leads to playing into a food system that decides who gets to be fed and who doesn't get to be fed. And it is a deeply racist, deeply broken by design food system. And eating local does not solve that if we're not willing to also address and challenge the broken public policies that decide who gets to eat local and who doesn't.
Saqib, I think it's what you're raising is also a really important thought piece around the relationship between the individual choice, and sort of institutional or kind of structural, systemic. Because I do think that people often, very large, want to make, in some ways, what they think are good choices for themselves. When we talk about, the term healthy, I think is certainly quite complicated too. Are we talking about nutritious? Are there other values that are attached to it? But making choices that are, I think people often believe that they want to make choices that might be better for the environment, better for labor practices for other people, but ultimately things like cost, convenience, taste preferences, access, all of these things really determine decisions that individuals make. And so I'm wondering, from each of you working, structurally, how can decisions at either the industry or the institutional level help steer individual choices in a more positive direction?
That's a complicated, you start touching on the social determinants of health, right? And so that's a whole big thing. I will still kind of go back and say it's that education, right? I don't recall. Maybe consider it privilege. My mother raised me a single mom. I went to Catholic school, private school, and she was a teacher, but I've learned a lot about things that my upbringing is different from everyone else's here. Everybody's got their own individual upbringing, and those that aren't fortunate enough to even be here, right? So nobody can be discredited. But the thing that you're touching on is like food. This commodity, it's a multi-billion-dollar big ag, right? It's very complicated. Who's to say that the person that goes and buys the dollar menu at the local fast food place, because they only have $5 to serve to feed their family dinner, and they have 3 children, that's the wrong decision, right? When the locally grown rice, the 5-pound bag is $4, right? And is that going to create a whole meal at home, right? So it's tough. What is that answer? Well, that's what I'm trying to get to with our food program as an institution, is to prove some kind of formula that can measure. This is what chefs balance all the time, is the labor cost and food cost, right? Food cost, talked about a sack of flour, $4, local bag, Lumberg or reinforcement, whatever, right? Point is, something locally is going to be more expensive. Why? Because California property taxes are more expensive, our labor is more expensive, everything's more expensive. So it's going to be, of course, more expensive than if we purchased rice from any other state in the United States, much less any other state or any other country. So let's just go with that. We know it's more expensive. So, but what is the value of that? Like, what is that paying for? That community benefit layer, right? So how can we quantify what that dollar amount is really going towards in our community, and advocate in ways for our food system and food to be a little more cost effective for the consumer? Not a burden on the farmer or rancher, but help us as consumers make that right decision and be able to say, if I have $5, can I actually feed my family, or do I have to be subject to whatever's in this value meal that I'm buying, right? That half of it probably isn't even real food. Right? Nothing against the food scientists here, but I'm just sticking to real meat and real wheat.
I mean, my first response would be like, stop listening to chefs, but I feel like that's disingenuous because we're chefs talking to you all right now, listening to us. So, I mean, I feel like moving away from the deification of like restaurant culture and chef culture, and listening to people who are in your community who like. Of course, if we want to change any system, we need to listen to the voices that are most at risk, right? Because their solutions will have the largest impact. And we need to follow the lead of the people who are going to be most greatly impacted by by a broken food system. And I feel like there's leaders in all of our communities that are doing that work, that need more resource, that need to be platformed, that need to be supported. And when I think about like how a change can come from like our industry and how that can be pushed forward, I think a lot about, well, I mean that, honestly, like there's so many cool on the ground projects that are trying to bring more light and more attention to like the failings of our local food systems because they're people that are working with their own communities, and I feel like that's where the solutions are. And then larger institutions putting their resources behind those solutions. I mean, what Chef Santana is doing, supporting local farmers and putting a lot of industrial, like institutional level resource behind local farmers to impact the food system is a really cool thing because it has this like massive scope of how it can support people. For us, one of the things I'm most proud of is that we do all like complete financial transparency. We're a completely open book with all of our staff. And I feel like if we, as diners, can demand and ask for that level of financial transparency in the food that we interact with, right? Like even just asking at the restaurant you eat with, like, hey, are you paying your staff well? How are the tips being shared? Is the kitchen getting some of these tips? Like just trying to engage in the financial aspect of the food that we're interacting with to kind of call into question what is already assumed, because shifts kind of that moment and brings up these uncomfortable conversations that oftentimes get ignored, and that those moments are important. And they're a way that we can hold the businesses that we love and the food projects that we love accountable in some way. And I feel like that has an impact. I mean, you're also going to be a jerk, but I think it's important to be a jerk to be able to do better and push and demand more from our community.
I disagree that you have to be a jerk. I believe in education, and I think that we just need to be more educated diners. And soon, one of the goals of the restaurant is to educate diners in this aspect, and we want to put on the back of the card when you get your receipt a breakdown on where the money goes. So if you had, I don't know, $100 meal at the restaurant, just break it down. What part goes into food costs, what part goes into labor, what part goes into taxes, so that you are really making educated choices on who you want to support and who you stand behind. And I think that once you have that knowledge that it's something that you're talking about, it can't go away. And I think that it's also your responsibility and your duty to ask those questions, because if you don't question us as chefs and you don't challenge what we're doing, the industry is never going to change. It has to come from both parts. It's not just chefs trying to make a change, but also diners going a little deeper and challenging us and demanding more from us.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I think that this piece of education, and you said earlier, Santana, that sometimes people don't know what they don't know. They don't know even that they can ask or can demand that. So if you have on that breakdown on the back, one that's of the receipt, it's providing the information. So it's providing that education, but it also is opening the door for a diner potentially to say to another restaurant, hey, at Masala y Maiz or somewhere else, I learned this. Can you tell me what does this look like at your restaurant? So it almost kind of can open the door or that tool to give diners a way or an entry point into asking that question more of others. Saqib, you had also sort of touched on with the transparency. Another question that I wanted to ask. Tonight's conversation is titled "Open Kitchens," which usually refers to the architectural design of the kitchen space because it's on display to diners. Right, it's creating visibility to watch chefs cook. And so each of you has also mentioned that transparency is really important to how you lead in the kitchen and kind of lead your teams and lead your work. Can you each, and Santana, starting with you, elaborate a bit more on what you mean by transparency in food service or food systems and why it's important to you?
I think, and all it was mentioned about an open book. I would invite anyone to journalists, look at audit our program, right? I have no problem with that. I don't know how many other places that claim to do what we're claiming or state that they're doing what they're saying they're doing. But our local farmers here, when I ask those questions, aren't selling to those same places, so it's confusing to me. But anyways, the transparency. Why has the food system gotten to be this like the way it is? Are you familiar with what a GPO is? So anybody in this audience, just randomly by a show of hands, what's a GPO? Group Purchasing Organization, right? Who belongs to GPOs? Other corporations, other food corporations. If I were to go to any of you, do you have any farmers in the house right now, or any food producer? Well, if I were to say, even if you were, so as a business person, right? Let's say it's just, you have a business, and you're in sales, you have a product to market. If I were to come to you and say, for the next 10 years, I guarantee you 60% of your throughput will be sold. You don't even have to worry about trying to sell it. It's going to be sold. How much better of a forecast on your future growth of your business could you do?
Would you please?
That is what the fundamental start of a lot of the food entities and corporations are. I won't name names, but we could just call it a cheese factory. So a cheese factory, which creates, start off with 60% of their throughput. And if I will purchase 60% of your throughput, will you give me a better deal? And you don't have to worry about marketing it or anything, so you can save all that money, give me a better deal, give me a price break, right? And I'm going to take that product and rebrand it and rename it into something else, right? And I'm going to further incentivize through the broadliner system of food service. There are two major ones, we won't name names, but they'll purchase from that GPO, rebrand that cheese, and then further incentivize operators, chefs at a restaurant level, chefs at an institutional level, hotel chefs, stadium chefs, any food person. You buy this cheese, we'll even credit you at the end of the month a little kickback. They don't call it kickbacks anymore, right? But it's a credit to further help your food cost line, chef. And we know that you as a chef are paying attention to your food costs and labor lines. So right now, if you just purchase this cheese, we'll call it cheddar cheese, right? And we know you're using cheddar cheese in your mac and cheese, right? Or your burger, whatever, right? You buy this cheese, right? On the volume that you purchase it at, the credit is big. So I'm incentivized to purchase that. Is that supporting any California dairy? No. Where's that GPO? Well, it's not in California. And there's multiple GPOs, we'll just put it that way. You can look that up. You can Google it on your phone. If we could figure out how to fix that, we know that that's where the opportunity of where large corporations and the local small farmers and ranchers miss the boat, right? But we don't want to recreate that wheel, right? Because we know where we're at right now. But we have to figure out how we can figure that part out. Contracts that are associated with that, because that GPO means we're going to purchase from you for the next 7 years, right? So that's a contract right there. heaven forbid you're trying to fix what you're trying to purchase as that cheese for the schools, for the K through 12s, or say myself coming into an entity, and it's like maybe there's already a contract in place. I gotta wait for that contract to expire, but you have to know that these are the problems with the system already in order to be able to change it. If you don't understand the problem and you're held to the financial bottom line of the Excel spreadsheet, which by the way, my favorite people in this industry are the directors of finance, because I have to explain to each one of them like why we're spending so much more on this beef versus this commodity beef, and they see all the commercials of why it can be cheaper. We have to explain all the nuances, right? And you see the eyes wide open, right? Versus it just being a number on a spreadsheet. They understand that it's more than that, right? But that's part of it, the contracts and how long these contracts go. 10 years is a long time. 2 contracts takes 20-year contract. Wow, 20 years ago, nobody in there, maybe 5% of us had a cell phone in our pocket. Now 100% of you, maybe 120%. I have 2 phones, right? So what has changed in 20 years, 10 years? And then technology, what's gonna change? Like if you engage in a 10-year contract right now, what's in 10 years from now? Why are we making those decisions and forward contracting with these large entities that are dictating what's in our food and what's being offered in our grocery stores, right? Which continue to condition us or decondition us from seasons. Because I don't know about your grocery store, but every grocery store I'll say like 90% of them, the tomatoes are in the same place, whether it's summer, spring, fall, winter, they're in the same spot. They come from different areas, but they're there, right? To buy. Right? That conditioning thing, it's really interesting.
And let's take that same model and apply it to corn.
I was hoping you'd talk about that.
There you go.
I'm not gonna say,
Why not? Name names.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say names. Just,
Yeah, go ahead.
following chef's lead, being nice.
They're so nice.
Same structure of purchasing. You apply it to a new commodity crop. It's everybody can see social media, the new trend, it's making your own tortillas at home. So there's this brand that has been marketing corn as third wave corn, and it's applying the same purchasing values into the countryside in Mexico. But what happens when we start talking about cultural sustainability? What happens to the communities that this corn is being bought from? Because it's all, and the most part, it's specialty land-raised corn. Corn in Mexico is intrinsically tied to tradition and lifestyle. So if we lose those beautiful, very rare land-raised corns, we're losing tradition and we're losing our culture. So the next time you're in Whole Foods and you see a bag of masarina that says blue corn, there's no way that blue corn masarina comes from one field. There are so many varieties of blue corn that have an intrinsic culinary and cultural use. So by you purchasing that bag of blue corn masarina, you are helping erase culture. However, it is marketed to you as an organic bag that from a company that is doing the right thing. That company is not doing the right thing. What I've been saying for a long time in my pursuit of good corn is that this country, the United States of America, needs to eat American corn. There is delicious American corn. So why look into the global south, into Mexico, to bring these exotic crops that we can have at home, and do these models, what these companies are doing. I don't know, who knows what a coyote is? Not the animal, but how do you say, the smugglers, right? So now these companies are creating the culture of coyotes for corn because they cannot supply the demand for land-raised corn there is in this country. So they're changing the whole ecosystem of corn.
I'm gonna hit that, like, touch on that. Who remembers when it was the quinoa you touched on it, Chef, earlier? You touched on quinoa, right? And everybody was classified or discovered to be a superfood. Right? And you saw quinoa all over the place. It was on like every restaurant. It could be on Indian to Mexican restaurants and everything in between. There's just quinoa. Where was it coming from? It's exactly what she's talking about, what we did in Peru. And it priced out an inherently a base product food that the people of those communities could no longer afford because we were buying it all, right? And so, not that it, it's like shame on us, but it's like just to, again, educate it, to be knowing about this. The other one, the acai berry, you guys can remember that 10 years ago, and it was all over the place, these smoothies and everything else, and then boba, and throwing your coffee, and throwing your pancakes. The point is, in South America, that was a problem. Same thing happened. So this thing with corn is happening right in our neighboring country, right? Right at our border, right? And call it the Tex-Mex combination of things, or we're so close to them and we're just maybe not realizing it, but it's happening. And it's 2024. It's not 1920. And nothing against 1920. We just definitely didn't know what we know now. Again, we all have a computer in our pockets. We call it a phone. You look it up for yourselves. It's not a lie. That's where it's coming from. Gratefully, with the quinoa that we serve at our hospital, we're sourcing it here in California because there are some ranchers that do, or farms that do grow it. So it's good. All right, we're taking that superfood and applying it, but we're paying attention to where it's coming from. That supply chain asks the question, just like on the back of the menus that we're talking about, where does that money go? It's not just food costs. What did you buy? What did that restaurant purchase? And what did you consume? Right? It's interesting. Who can really say out of one whole complete meal that you had today? I had 5 if we include the 3 snacks in between. I still haven't had my ice cream. But I can tell you what about 85% of every meal that I've eaten where it was coming from. I think that's pretty darn good. And I know this industry. But there's still that 15% that's it's tough to figure out. And that's done on purpose. And I guess the question is why?
Which comes back to the transparency piece. I think, and the education that people want this information and being able to trust it, or the ease of access of finding it to start asking more questions.
Go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
please.
I'm also
No.
seeing the time
Yeah.
warning.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, when I think about transparency in the food system, I think about each of our role in the food system and how we don't want to see ourselves as active members of the food system. We just think of ourselves as consumers in general, right? And we don't think about all the many ways that we interact with the food system at each level. So, yes, someone's growing food here, but we are also maybe ordering food on an app. We might be composting in our house or throwing garbage away, right? We interact with farmers who are producing our food, delivery people who are delivering our food, people that are picking up our food waste and our compost, and all those are us acting within the food system and leveraging our power and our privileges in different ways and engaging with the food system. There's that 15% that you're talking about, that's initial, it's intentionally obscure, is so difficult to get to the bottom of, and none of us are going to be perfect because we're living in a broken food system. We're living in many broken systems that intersect around a lot of really fucked up points of pressure that impact our lives and impact the lives of those we care about. But I think that trying to be critical in our consumption is a lot better than trying to be conspicuous in our consumption, if that makes sense. like all this food trends that we're talking about, right? Avocados and acai and the quinoa and all this stuff that you would see now on TikTok or on Instagram of like the new food trend, and you want to post about it, and you want to show off that you're engaging with it, or you're at the hot new restaurant, or all these things that kind of feed the beast of a broken food culture, as opposed to being critical of how we consume and trying to get to the point of engaging or asking the hard questions of how is the labor being paid, or where is the food being sourced from, and trying to educate ourselves on it. Like that gets to a level of transparency that gives us more agency, where we're not just consumers, but we're active participants in the food system and active participants in trying to demand something better for our community. And I feel like that type of transparency is something I'm interested in.
And I also think, as you're saying, that the idea of active participation. And it's made me think too that for all of you, your experiences kind of leading up to where kind of you are in your careers and your roles now, and your vantage points about food have been quite varied. And a little bit of a side note. So I've learned that in terms of the history of hospital food, actually, that I think it was in the 1950s, that the hospital industry turned actually and looked at the airline industry as a way of completely sort of revamping how hospital food was served, particularly through the use of temperature-controlled carts, the rolling carts, and food trays. And so, thinking a little bit about that, hospitals turning to airlines, are there other industries or fields or even other academic disciplines, from which you each draw inspiration if you're thinking about your own food or your service model? Like, where else do you look for kind of the inspiration of what you're doing?
Depending on what kind of inspiration you're looking for. If it's social justice, if it's pure artistic inspiration, if it's menu inspiration. We are in one of the best places to research food history. So there's many places. So I think that oftentimes we get very, very squared-minded, or it can be a very squared-minded discipline where it's like food and farms and like foods of the world that will inspire you. But there's so much more. For our political work, we look a lot at the movements of resistance of the global South. I personally love to look at archives of what people were eating, the utensils that they were using, and that starts igniting my imagination of what a dish could be, or a whole menu, or how to approach my cooking.
I look a lot at, political movements and social organizations, right? And trying to look at how food has been used consistently as a solution. Like, food is one of the most powerful ways to oppress us. And it's one of the first, controlling someone's access to food is one of the first ways you can destroy their community. That's all systems, all colonization has always started with destroying the local food system. When the Europeans came to the Americas, killing the buffalo, of course, damming the rivers to stop the run of salmon. The French in Haiti ruined and destroyed all of the indigenous wildlife that the Taino people were eating, the Aro people were eating on the islands, right? This is the thing we see over and over again across the world. The Israelis are doing it in Palestine. It's all over and over again. So when I think about who are the communities and the leaders that have also then been using food as a tool of resistance, and then I see the impact of it, that inspires me a lot. Because then you can see the impact of it over a massive scale. We have school lunches and we have a school food program in the United States. Does anyone know why? Who started that? Black Panther Party for self-defense, that's right, from their survival program. So the BPP see that kids aren't performing well in school because they're not getting access to food. So in their communities, they start providing free food to everyone, to any school-age child that's on their way to school. They're doing this with the SF Diggers who are this hippie group in San Francisco that joined forces with the Black Panthers to provide a massive scaled out version that then went all across the country. They pressured the US government because they showed the results of like, look at how well these kids are doing in school when we're providing them breakfast. And these were just volunteers cooking food for them. The Diné people and the work that they've done to rescue glass gem corn in the United States and indigenous corn varieties in the US, like, that's really inspiring to me because then you can see this, that the work that we do as cooks isn't just about cooking, and when we eat, it's not just about eating, but have this opportunity to create change, and that feels really good because kitchen work sucks, restaurant work sucks, but then you get to do something really cool and you remember like, oh yeah, this can have a lasting impact.
Bad restaurant work.
Bad restaurant work sucks.
Good restaurant work
It's really
is
cool.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Cooking is beautiful.
Yes.
When it's done right,
Yeah.
it's fucking beautiful.
Yeah, and good restaurants. We are hiring.
This would align with, I know, I'm a realist, right? I know that it's impossible for me to know how to cook every nationality, regional style of cuisine. Impossible. For somebody to say they can do it all, I feel like something to be said about that individual. But so I try to focus and learn about, when we talk about cultures, we start looking about the diversity of our community. Even UC Davis as an employer is one of the most diverse employers in the world, one of them, right? And so who's to say that I can make the best Mexican food? Who's to say that I can make the best Indian food? Who's to say that my team and I, because it takes a team, right, that we make the best Ethiopian food, right? Why not, as I look at the future of this program, so 7 years into it, and where does it look like in the future, to not inadvertently offend anybody, right? And we look at what we've been doing. We've been doing this all the time. Anybody heard of Meals on Wheels and their grandparents maybe getting served this stuff? Did they really pay attention to what ethnicity they were? I know my grandma was getting, meatloaf and mashed potatoes as 100% Mexican, right? There was no Latin flair to those meals that I recall. And not that that was bad. But again, it's going back to like, okay, just giving you some food and telling you to eat it, right? We came out of COVID. All these things were going on when Meals on Wheels, businesses were not the same. They weren't working right, right? And there was a lot of other things that came out of it. Family meal program came out of that with a coalition of restaurants, right? Italian, Mexican, all these restaurants kind of came together, Chinese, right? And so all of a sudden we're like, oh, you could start getting the Chinese food to the people that eat Chinese food, right? And the Mexican meals to the Latin culture people, right? All of a sudden people started liking the food. Weird, right? And I'm being facetious there. Like my point is that we have to look at things differently, right? Just because I know how to make a turkey sandwich and it's easy to do, and it's like, but I give it to my say my grandmother's sister, she's gonna be like, what is this, right? She's gonna say, where's my tamale or something, right? It's like, so it doesn't mean they're just automatically gonna eat it. So those cultures, to preserve them, I don't want to inadvertently make it the wrong way, so why not continue to learn and further invest into my time in the community and work with those local ethnic restaurants and then partner with them. They do it well. Obviously they're doing it well, they have a business over it. Why wouldn't I partner with a restaurant like yours, right? You're doing it well. I would. You guys go ahead and take all the Mexican food, right? The orders. But the point is like, why not? There is no box. Right? Don't think outside of the box. There is no box. We put ourselves in these boxes. Those boxes of conditioning. Right? So we have to think differently.
Well, and as you're saying that the inspiration for all of you really comes back, I think, down to this like the humanistic sustainability, right? This idea of culture and of people and of finding inspiration in what people are capable of doing too when it comes to food and being creative and even in the face of real challenges. I have many more questions for you that I'm interested in. We certainly want to make sure that we have time for our audiences, both here and online. So I think we're going to open it up to questions for our panelists. I know if you're here in the room, you can please, if you want to raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone to you. And online, again, please put in your questions into the question feature in the on Zoom. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, my name is Wonhong, undergraduate student for food science. I had a question for the Masala y Maiz restaurant. I was wondering what your hiring process was. Was it equal opportunity or is it fully feminist, only women owned?
What do you mean by fully feminist hiring?
Because you're trying to provide an opportunity for all your workers, especially since it's 12 to 6, right? It's to make sure they get home safe. You provide loans to the single mothers. Are there high interest rates? Is there anything of concern? Is it nonprofit? Or is it simply like a restaurant ideal?
The loans are no interest.
No interest.
Is there a limit to that? Is it restricted to anything? Does it have to be a single mother?
No, it's restricted to the capabilities, the economic capabilities of the restaurant at the time. Because we have very small margins, so however the restaurant is doing, it's the amounts that we can loan. Because if we loan everything, we would run ourselves to the ground. And we are not only, we don't only hire women.
Okay.
Yeah, and the thing is that everyone can be a feminist,
Feminist.
right? Like,
Of course.
that's the great thing about feminism.
Of course.
We can all be feminists, and so we hire anyone and everyone, right? As long as you can show up to work on time and you're interested in our work and you're committed to learning and growing. Like we do all that, but the hiring process is very complex and it's long because you were not hired by Norma and I, you're hired by a team. And the team interviews you and the team signs off on your hire and all that. People who work with us don't have to share our politics, but they have to support and believe in that the restaurant can make our community better. And we do that in a lot of different ways. It's a feminist business because we're creating a better future, and that's a lot of what feminism is.
So would you say it's an equal opportunity employer for like race, age, skills?
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
I think we're actually, because we have so many other questions to come in, we're going to move on to another one, but thank you very much for your question. We're going to turn for a moment to an online question. So someone wants to know, again, thinking about like education and choice, how can someone who wants to eat avocados ethically consume them?
There are delicious California-grown avocados.
There is a season.
There's a season. Yeah.
Weird, right? And we do grow them here in our region. You grow avocados? There we go,
Yeah.
perfect.
Don't eat Hass avocados.
Why is that?
Hass avocados were developed to be a resistant crop that could travel and can mature in the boxes that it travels. So some of the original avocados native to Mexico. Some of the original avocado crops are being run out by Hass because of its capitalist accessibility, let's say, to put it in a way. So there's other, I'm going to say, there's avocado criollos, the little ones that you can eat the skin. There's fuerte, like
Delicious.
the fuertes are my favorite avocados, and they were pushed aside because their skin is softer, so they would get mushed in the boxes, and people would lose money.
Can I ask one follow-up? Because some of our viewers online may not actually be in California. They might actually be watching from New York. So does the same eating California avocados apply to our...
Do your research. Don't be lazy. That's what I have to say about avocados.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't remember your name, but you talked about GPOs and forward-looking long-term purchase contracts with heavy price pressure, and so my question to you is, does that impact the quality of the food?
Santana, does it impact?
The price
Well,
pressure?
Well, it's, the quality is a better quality, I'll admit. So our YOLO butternut squash right now, so we're in season with that right now. That's better quality than it's being harvested, put in boxes in a truck, driven 40 miles to the hospital, and then we use it, versus potentially weeks of a process of getting it from A to B coming from another country. So quality-wise, I think the closer that you, wherever you're sourcing your products from, and I get it, you know, we're in California, we're in Northern California, we have the bounty here, and that's where I say there's no reason why we shouldn't do it. We're not in Middle America or say all the way up in Maine, right, and dealing with snow 30% of the year, right? It's different, right? We just have to look at what's around you. So in this case, when I'm talking about it being more expensive, it is more expensive, but it's always going to be more expensive. I could buy every orange grown in California, all of it, contract with every farmer that grows an orange. It'll never be cheaper than a Florida orange, even though I volume purchased everything in the state. Again, why? Our property taxes are more expensive. Our minimum wage here in this state is twice the normal average across the United States, right? The insurances, the certifications here in this state. So to think that it would ever be cheaper, why are we even having that conversation? Much less than even trying to, so from state to state, much less compare it and say that they're even paying less in our neighboring country.
I think I was trying to flip the question.
Okay.
And say for those that were doing long-term contracts that are very price-driven and didn't care where it came from, are they really getting the quality food?
Oh, no, that is not a model that is focused on quality, that's focused on mass production. So again, the cheese comment, right? So
Yeah,
the cheese,
right?
right? So we'll say like that commodity cheese, if you compared it to say Petaluma Creamery cheese in Petaluma, where we purchased all the cheese to make all the nacho cheese for every Kings game, every home game, right? That was a crazy thing that we were doing, but we were making nacho cheese every game with Petaluma Creamery cheese. Was it expensive? Was it more expensive? Yes. Was it a better quality nacho cheese? In my opinion, yeah. I knew exactly what the ingredients were, and I don't know what are in those cans of. Okay, bueno. I'll throw that out there. I don't know. So
I went to the Stornetta's Dairy in second grade, and when I buy their milk, it never goes bad in the refrigerator.
there's
It's all
something to be
clover
said.
now, but I've been living on it, so thank you.
Yeah. And you're touching on preservatives too, because that's the other part of our program is when you're sourcing things that are close to where they're grown, you don't have to worry about them sitting around for 2 weeks. My hospital, nothing's there. Not my hospital. In the hospital and in our food program that we're running, we don't usually have food there longer than 4 days. 4 days max. Bring it in the door and it's out in 4 days or consumed. Right? So why would we need a loaf of bread to sit around on our counter for 2 weeks? We don't.
Thank you all. This was so wonderful. An emergent idea I heard from all of you is the idea of creativity as part of food practice. And as someone who has a background, or I work in performance and media and food, I think a lot about how food or the arts don't show up in our culinary education always. Sometimes that happens passively, or that happens if you're like willing to run between the food science building and the theater building. It's a little bit of a ways. But I'm curious if you could each speak, maybe starting with Norma, since you have an arts background, of what is the role of the arts or creative thinking when it comes to radical change in our food system?
Art has the power to tell a story, right? And that's sort of what we learn. And when we are feeding you, there's a saying in Spanish that says, comemos con los ojos. We eat with our eyes. And one of the basic ways in which we introduce art into our teams is in plating. I always in my plating make reference to different eras of painting, different styles, different countries, different composition methodologies. And then we use that as a tool at the restaurant to tell the larger story. We enamor people first with the way that our food looks, because it's really beautiful. And then that opens the door to tell the larger story that we want to tell.
I think restaurant work is all theater. It's all performance. It's a lot of movement. It's a lot of storytelling. It's dance, like in the way that we move and what we do to our bodies as cooks or as hospitality workers are very similar to what performance artists go through in that physical toll. We use a lot of theater and performance teachings in how we approach our hospitality work. But restaurant work is also a lot of smoke and mirrors, right? We talk about like we have the meeting before service, and then the curtains go up and service starts and the show starts, and you just kind of maintain this facade in the show throughout the whole process of it. In terms of creative thinking and radical change, I feel like anytime food is used as a tool or vehicle to enact change, right, that's a creative solution. The Black Panther is looking at poor school performance in their communities and the down the line impacts of poor scholastic achievement amongst their youth, and approaching that by saying, well, actually they need to have breakfast. To me, that's a very creative solution. Not just they need to have breakfast, but that breakfast needs to be cooked by members of the community that show that they as a community are invested in the well-being of that child and are invested in that child having a free, healthy, nutritious breakfast that's culturally relevant every day, and that should be accessible to all the children that are going to school. That to me is a very creative solution. I think performance art and just art in general, right, forces us to think or teaches us to think, to ask the questions that aren't being asked and to look for what are the voices and narratives that are absent in the room and to come at things from a different angle in order to engage with a piece critically. And I feel like that is how we can create systemic change. That's how we can create change in our community at every level.
Yes. I will agree on that one. So I know we're going to more questions.
Hi, my question is for you, Saqib. So you describe yourself as a food justice organizer, and as someone who's hoping, maybe one day in the future to use that title myself, I'm wondering if you can expand on what that means to you to be a food justice organizer.
I feel like it's a thing, I'm just going to repeat a little bit what I say, but basically, like, I started work, I was a restaurant worker, and I was really burnt out by how restaurant work happened and what that meant and what it implied in the type of restaurants I was working at the time. Hashtag not all restaurants. And I started to see like the radical potential that food has, dining, the radical potential of dining, and the revolutionary potential of cooking, because I was seeing that in different political movements, and I was seeing that be reflected in my community in different ways. So I started working in my community on the ground, and I think oftentimes when we want to do activist work, we try to work in another community that we might see as being disadvantaged, so I'm going to go there and help them, as opposed to using my privilege to better my own community in order to then impact my neighbors and to kind of create a better food system for all of us, right? And so I started working within my community and trying to see how I could leverage my privileges and my knowledge and all that stuff to do work on the ground, to create a better food system. And that was a lot of different things. I was volunteering in different organizations and part of People's Grocery when it first started in West Oakland, and then creating my own projects and kind of going and down that line. But a lot of it was, how can I learn from other social organizations like the Black Panthers, like the Diggers, like other social groups that were all using food that have been doing this work to kind of create a safety net in their neighborhoods and create kind of more stronger community ties. And the way I did that was through cooking and through feeding people. Yes.
Hello, my name is Indiana. I just wanted to ask, or just give a little context. There's a lot of work being done in food insecurity and to combat that, but I don't see a lot of work in combating cultural food insecurity. And as someone who has worked at the meat lab on campus in the process of harvesting, butchering, and sales, I know the impact of getting these so-called specialty cuts to people in the community who use them to celebrate and affirm their identity and culture. And so my question to you is, how can producers, restaurants, and businesses combat cultural food insecurity when the market is run by fads or staple socially normative foods?
Well, that's a good question, and what we're doing, so say beef. So you're talking about butchering, so I'll stick with just some quick beef. Sourcing organic, grass-fed, California grown, never leave the state beef is actually kind of difficult. But 100% of our beef program is that. How did that get created? Well, it's actually collaborating with local restaurants and other chefs too, and saying, I'm not ever just, we used to do it on Christmas Day, we did prime rib for the patients, but then I was like, the rules for cooking it to 155 was just drying it out, and I was like, okay, we're trying to do something good and we're serving jerky. So I was like, okay, I don't need New York steaks, I don't need beef tenderloins, filet mignons, I don't need the prime ribs, but the restaurants do, right? I need grinds, I need sausages, I need for bolognese sauces, you know, I need burger patties, right? A little bit more simple. How many head of cattle does the Sacramento region really need, you know, to go through, right? So we started looking at this. I was like, wait, I'm trying to like source X amount of meat because I can forecast how much butternut squash I need by the menus that are designed to run during certain seasons. Yes, they change 4 times a year, but we're having a burger all year long, right? So I can forecast that. To address what you're saying, that is potentially the next step. First is establishing, can we just make it to where we're buying, knowing where we're buying from, and it not leaving the state? Yes, that's put in place now with processors. Now it's about those processors, the next step, because this just got confirmed 8 months ago, because it's been a very big problem with beef, but same thing as with pork. But the next step would be letting those and communicating through our processor, all those specialty cuts, there is a market. They just don't know that it's where it is yet, right? So it is a new concept that we're trying to work on. And then that would go to any restaurants as well, right?
If I understand your question correctly, you're asking about how cultural relevance or like cultural specificity and butchering or meat sourcing can happen?
At the meat lab, we provide cuts that aren't available at your Save Mart or Target,
Yeah.
and so being able to provide those meats that aren't at that huge price or are scarce to get, like things like oxtail or buche or lengua,
So cool.
these kinds of things.
I mean, that's really cool. For me, I guess this question was like that our food system is so focused on Eurocentricity in the way we approach like as the norm, right? So when the meat cuts and all that, we cook one of our favorite dishes at the restaurant is suadero, which is like a kind of like a beef belly confit, like a beef belly cut that's very common taco in Mexico City, but it's really hard to get that cut here unless you're at a Mexican market or unless you're asking specifically from a butcher to cut the meat in a certain way. I don't really know the point I want to make with this. Like, honestly, I grew up in an Ethiopian family, Kenyan family, and South Asian family. We all use meat differently and have different names and different cuts. And that applies to all the different communities here. I think that what you're doing is really cool, and that's so cool that that's a service that the meat department here offers. I'm just awed by that, so I kind of forgot everything else. And I responded to it, so like, oh, that's really neat.
Personally, I would love to keep this conversation going for another hour and a half, but we have reached the end of our program tonight. So I want to thank you all very much for such an incredibly inspiring conversation, and just to hand it over to Ned Spang, the director of the Robert Mondavi Institute, to close us out.
Thanks, everybody. That was amazing. So thank you so much, Chef Keval, Chef Listman, Chef Diaz. Just a really incredible discussion. And I was so struck because, you know, we started at the beginning saying how tough the restaurant industry is. It's the hardest. It's the worst, right? It's so difficult. Yet you guys are asking more of yourselves beyond just serving the food. You're taking the time to learn about these systems, agricultural systems, social systems, economic systems, environmental systems. That would be incredible to do all that. But then you're also trying to change those systems, which is this other huge lift. I mean, 10 times the work of running a restaurant to do all this stuff in the way that you're, you know, applying your vision to it. So I just want to thank you again. It was really amazing to think and be welcomed into your world tonight, so appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you, of course. Really appreciate you supporting us here at the Robert Mondavi Institute, the UC Davis Library. It's always a pleasure to see your faces here. We're so proud to be able to bring such great discussions to the community here. A recording of this will be available in a week or so, so if you want to watch it again, I mean, it was that good. You can watch it online or share it with your friends, but definitely get the word out. This was an interesting discussion. And thank you again for joining us, and good night. Thank you.